I still remember standing outside the funeral home after the service ended. People were hugging each other, sharing quiet memories about my mom, and slowly heading to their cars. I was emotionally exhausted and trying to accept that she was really gone. Then Merrick walked over to me with a calm expression that didn't match the moment. He wasn't crying or talking about Mom. Instead, he looked me in the eye and said the house belonged to him now, as if the matter had already been settled. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood him. I asked what he meant, but he simply repeated himself and acted like there was nothing left to discuss. The words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't thinking about money or property that day. I was still grieving the woman who raised us. Hearing my own brother make that claim before our family had even finished saying goodbye left me stunned. I looked around, expecting someone else to react, but everyone seemed too distracted or too uncomfortable to say anything. Merrick walked away without another word, leaving me standing there with questions I couldn't answer. During the drive home, I kept replaying the conversation in my mind. The confidence in his voice bothered me the most. It didn't sound like a guess or an emotional reaction. It sounded like he believed he had every right to say it. That feeling stayed with me the entire evening. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding between siblings. Something had happened while I was focused on caring for Mom from a distance, and I was about to find out just how much had been hidden from me. A few days later, our family met at Mom's house to organize her papers and begin handling everything she had left behind. I expected us to calmly go through the documents together, but Merrick acted like the process was only a formality. Every time I reached for a file or asked about important records, he brushed my questions aside. He kept saying the house was his because he had spent years taking care of Mom. According to him, that was all the explanation anyone needed. I asked if Mom had ever written that down or spoken to everyone about it, but he refused to give a clear answer. Before I could continue, Holden quietly pulled me aside. He told me I should stop arguing and let Merrick have the house. He said taking legal action would cost too much money, create endless stress, and tear the family apart forever. I expected my husband to stand beside me, or at least encourage me to learn the truth first. Instead, he seemed more interested in ending the conversation as quickly as possible. The way he spoke didn't feel natural. It sounded like he had already made up his mind before we even walked into the house. When I asked why he was so certain, he avoided looking at me and changed the subject. That small moment stayed with me long after we left. On the drive home, he barely spoke, and whenever I brought up Mom's wishes, he only repeated that peace was worth more than a house. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like important decisions had already been made without me, and I was the last person to know. Over the next couple of weeks, the pressure kept growing. Every time I saw a relative, the conversation always turned back to the house. My aunt said Merrick had given up years of his life to stay with Mom, so I should thank him instead of questioning him. My uncle told me that some things were more important than legal papers. They all spoke as if they already knew the whole story, but none of them asked what I had done for Mom during those same years. I had helped in different ways because I lived farther away. I paid many of her medical bills, covered repair costs when something broke in the house, and sent money whenever she needed it. I never kept score because she was my mother, not a responsibility to measure. When I tried to explain this, people either interrupted me or changed the subject. It felt like my support had been erased simply because it wasn't seen every day. At home, I showed Holden bank records and payment receipts that clearly proved I had helped Mom financially for a long time. I hoped he would finally understand why I couldn't simply walk away. Instead, he looked at the papers for only a few seconds before telling me that keeping peace with the family was more important than fighting over property. His words hurt more than I wanted to admit. This was no longer about the value of the house. It became about respecting my mother's life and making sure her true wishes were not buried under guilt, pressure, and one-sided stories. I knew that giving up now would mean accepting a version of events that simply wasn't true. A few days later, Merrick called another family meeting at Mom's house. He walked into the living room carrying a folded piece of paper and said he finally had proof that the house belonged to him. He unfolded it carefully and claimed Mom had written an agreement saying he would receive the home because he had cared for her during her final years. Before I even had a chance to read it, several relatives nodded their heads and said that settled everything. Some even congratulated Merrick for his dedication. I asked if I could hold the paper and read every word for myself. Merrick quickly pulled it back and said there was no reason because everyone already knew it was real. His reaction immediately made me uneasy. If the document was honest, why wouldn't he let me examine it? I calmly asked to see the original copy, but his attitude changed in an instant. He raised his voice and accused me of trying to take away something Mom had willingly given him. Then he said I had abandoned her when she needed family the most. Those words cut deeply because they were completely false. I wanted to defend myself, but nobody seemed interested in listening. A few relatives looked away while others silently stood beside Merrick. The room suddenly felt cold, and I realized I was standing there completely alone. No matter what I said, their minds already seemed made up. I left the house with tears in my eyes, wondering how everything had changed so quickly. Instead of grieving together, my own family had turned against me, and somehow I had become the person everyone blamed without anyone asking for the full truth. After that meeting, I decided to stop arguing with people and focus only on finding facts. I went through every box of papers Mom had kept over the years. It took hours, but I refused to give up. I found canceled checks, insurance papers, medical receipts, and other records showing exactly who had paid different expenses. Mom had always been organized, and she had written small notes beside many of the payments. Then I found an old notebook tucked inside a drawer. As I carefully turned the pages, I saw that she had listed household bills, repair costs, and medical expenses in her own handwriting. Near the back of the notebook, an envelope slipped onto the floor. Inside was a letter Mom had written several months before she passed away. She wrote that she loved both of her children equally and never wanted money or property to separate us. She hoped everything would be handled fairly because family should always come before possessions. Reading those words brought tears to my eyes, but it also gave me strength. Later that week, I returned home earlier than expected after running errands. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard Holden speaking quietly on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen, but I clearly heard Merrick's name. They were talking about lawyers, legal costs, and what might happen if I challenged the house. Holden sounded far too familiar with the situation. I quietly stepped back before they noticed me. My heart was racing. Until that moment, I believed my husband was simply trying to avoid conflict. Now I started wondering if he had known much more than he had ever admitted, and that thought frightened me more than anything Merrick had done. I couldn't ignore what I had heard, so that evening I asked Holden a simple question. I wanted to know why he had been talking to Merrick about lawyers without telling me. At first, he denied that anything was wrong and said I had misunderstood the conversation. I stayed calm and repeated exactly what I had heard. After a long silence, his face changed. He sat down and finally admitted there was something he had hidden from me. A few years earlier, his small business had struggled, and he had borrowed money from Merrick to keep it running. He had never told me because he was embarrassed and believed he could repay it on his own. Instead, the debt remained. Holden confessed that Merrick had recently offered to forget the entire amount if I stopped fighting over Mom's house. That was why he had been asking me to let everything go. He said he thought ending the family dispute would also solve his financial problem. Hearing those words felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. My husband hadn't been protecting me from stress. He had been protecting himself. Every conversation we had shared suddenly looked different in my mind. His advice had never been about keeping peace. It had been about paying a debt without using his own money. I looked at the man I had trusted for years and barely recognized him. I realized that Merrick had not been working alone. The two people I depended on the most had quietly made decisions that affected my future without my knowledge. For the first time since losing Mom, I truly felt alone, unsure whether I could save my family or even my marriage. For 2 days, I barely spoke to anyone. I needed time to think clearly instead of making decisions while I was angry and hurt. Then I looked at Mom's letter again and reminded myself that she had always believed the truth would matter in the end. That thought gave me the strength to move forward. I contacted an estate attorney with a good reputation and scheduled a meeting. I brought every document I had collected, including bank statements, canceled checks, medical receipts, insurance records, and Mom's notebook. The attorney carefully reviewed everything and told me that facts would carry much more weight than family opinions. We created a timeline showing exactly when I had helped Mom financially and how often I had contributed to her care. After that meeting, I changed the way I dealt with everyone. I stopped arguing with relatives and no longer tried to defend myself during phone calls or family visits. Whenever Merrick acted confident or made another claim about the house, I simply listened and said very little. He seemed pleased by my silence, and probably believed I had finally accepted defeat. Even Holden noticed that I was no longer trying to convince anyone. Neither of them realized I was quietly preparing for court instead of giving up. Every evening, I organized another folder, checked another record, and wrote down another detail that might become important later. The more prepared I became, the calmer I felt. I no longer wanted revenge through anger or shouting. I wanted the truth placed in front of a judge where nobody could interrupt, twist my words, or pressure me into staying silent. That became my only goal. The day of the first court hearing finally arrived. Merrick walked into the courtroom looking completely confident. He spoke as though the outcome had already been decided and repeated that he alone had cared for Mom, so the house belonged to him. He pointed to the handwritten agreement and insisted it proved everything. My attorney stayed calm and never interrupted him. When it was our turn, the attorney began presenting the evidence one piece at a time. Bank records showed the money I had regularly sent for Mom's care. Medical receipts and insurance payments confirmed that I had covered many important expenses over the years. Then Mom's longtime neighbor testified that she had often seen me visiting, helping with appointments, and making sure Mom had what she needed. The neighbor also said Mom had spoken many times about wanting both of her children treated fairly. After that, my attorney focused on the handwritten agreement. Small details in the document did not match other papers Mom had written during the same period, raising serious questions about whether it could be trusted. The courtroom became very quiet as Merrick struggled to answer simple questions. Then the discussion turned to Holden. During testimony, it became clear that he and Merrick had been talking privately about legal costs and the house long before I knew anything about it. Holden could not explain why he had hidden those conversations from me. I watched both of them lose the confidence they had carried into the courtroom. Their story, which had once sounded so certain, slowly began falling apart as each new piece of evidence revealed another problem. For the first time in months, I felt that the truth was finally being heard. The final hearing was the hardest day I had faced since Mom's passing. Everyone who had been involved was in that room, and for the first time, nobody could avoid the truth. Merrick was asked direct questions about the agreement he had presented. After several moments of silence, he admitted that Mom had talked about helping him financially because he cared for her, but she had never officially given him the house. That admission changed everything. The paper he had relied on for months no longer looked like a clear promise. My attorney explained that a conversation about future help was very different from a legal transfer of ownership. Then the attention turned to Holden. The judge questioned why he had hidden his conversations with Merrick while repeatedly telling me to stop fighting. Holden tried to explain that he was only trying to avoid a bigger family conflict, but his actions showed he had another reason. He had allowed me to believe he was supporting me while secretly working toward an outcome that benefited him. Hearing that in front of everyone was painful. I had spent so much time wondering if I was being unreasonable, but now I understood that I had been pushed into silence by people who should have protected me. Looking across the room, I saw Merrick and Holden no longer looked certain. The control they once had over the situation was gone. I still felt sadness because this battle had destroyed relationships I once valued, but I also felt a sense of peace. Mom's wishes were no longer hidden under accusations and pressure. Her voice, through her words and records, was finally being respected. When the court finally made its decision, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. The judge ruled that Mom's estate had to be handled according to the proper legal documents, not based on promises, pressure, or a questionable agreement. The house was no longer something Merrick could simply claim. Everything would be divided fairly, just as Mom had wanted. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. After the case ended, I had a serious conversation with Holden. I wanted to believe our marriage could survive, but the damage went deeper than one mistake. He had hidden the truth, made choices behind my back, and allowed me to believe he was protecting me when he was actually protecting himself. I realized that trust was not something I could rebuild alone. I made the painful decision to end our marriage and move forward on my own. Merrick also had to face the consequences of his actions. The relatives who once defended him began seeing the situation differently after hearing all the facts. Many of them apologized for judging me before knowing the truth. I still miss my mother every day, and losing her will always be one of the hardest experiences of my life. But I no longer feel trapped by the pain that followed her death. I learned that standing up for yourself does not mean you are destroying a family. Sometimes it means refusing to let lies become the final story. The house was never the thing I truly wanted. What mattered most was honoring my mother's wishes and keeping my own dignity. After everything I lost, I finally found peace.